All right. Good morning, interwebs, and welcome everybody to a presentation of a Splendid Failure, which is a war game that my colleagues at the Georgetown University Wargaming Society and I that we designed together as part of Professor Sebastian Bay's Basics of Wargame Design class. So a Splendid Failure is going to be a academic or educational war game that was initially sort of conceived by this quote, or based on this quote by W.B. Du Bois, essentially characterizing the sort of failure of the federal-led Reconstruction effort after the Civil War in the American South. In which W.B. Du Bois said that essentially the attempt to make Black men American citizens was, in a certain sense, all a failure, but a splendid failure. So what we will be exploring in this war game and through this presentation is going to be the sort of political dynamics at a national level that led to the ultimate failure of radical Reconstruction. Now, of course, there are many different levels of analysis that you can take for such a complex topic. In this case, we are taking a sort of national level political view, but there are many other good games that are out there that take more of a community-based level or more of a military counterinsurgency and that sort of thing. So we'll be talking a little bit about that later, but primarily this game is first and foremost an educational political game. So to start with our agenda, I'm going to begin with a brief overview of sort of the historical schema of this game, the time period that it takes place in, talk a little bit about our goals in designing this project, go into a little bit of a breakdown about the components that are needed to play this game, as well as the different player factions available, take you through some of the major themes of gameplay, so the player's victory conditions, the sequence of play, some of those main core mechanics that really drive gameplay, as well as some of the ways in which we've incorporated sort of strategy tips to help first-time gamers really to be able to jump into the game and understand some of those core concepts in an educational context. I'll then finish talking just sort of a little bit about our development process for this game, some of the future changes that we might be considering making, considering challenges that we've come across, and then open up the floor to discussion at the end, hopefully about 20-25 minutes, for y'all's feedback, as well as any questions that you might have. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into it. So to start off, to sort of set the scene, what we are covering in this game is going to be the time period that's often referred to as radical Reconstruction. So this is the sort of decade following the Civil War from 1867 through 1876, during which historians generally agree there was sort of an inflection point in American history, during which the federal government and the U.S. military, sort of for the first time, although as we've seen, not the last time, attempted to simultaneously reconstruct economically a war-torn area in the South, while simultaneously attempting to bring greater democracy and civil liberties to that area. And so what we really wanted to focus on in this game is to recreate the incentive structures and competing priorities, negotiating dynamics encountered by federal policymakers at the beginning of radical Reconstruction in 1867, all the way through the election of 1876, the Hayes-Tilden election, in which Republicans eventually basically ceded all power over counterinsurgency operations and Reconstruction in the South in exchange for presidential power. Now, of course, this is a little bit of an abstraction. There's plenty of debate in saying that Reconstruction really began prior to 1867 in some states, and certainly continued, especially at a community level, long after 1876. However, for sort of framing our game, these are sort of the boundaries within which we are operating, because this is when national level politics really played a major role in Reconstruction. Now, we did want to start just sort of addressing, a very important, addressing the fact that we are talking about some very important things through this game. This is a historical time period that was marked by atrocity, the ramifications of which, of course, we still deal with today. So at every point during our design process, we were constantly sort of checking with each other and with external consultants, just kind of considering, how to address the brutal violence and racism of this period in a way that didn't belittle or gamify the suffering of Black Americans, not justifying the actions of white supremacist terrorists, but also wanting to make sure that we were emphasizing the agency of players at the same time. And so this, of course, brought us into this little this dilemma that we struggle with throughout the entire design process, which is maintaining player agency while also being, sensitive to, to the backgrounds of the people who might be playing our game. So as our main purpose is educational, we did ultimately decide that the most important aspect of this game is to convey the true scale and nature of these atrocities. We didn't want to be, sugarcoating anything. We didn't want to be, whitewashing or playing down the truly repugnant nature of what happened in a lot of these communities. And so, but at the same time, we didn't want to force players, to be committing these acts themselves. So the path that we ultimately took was to give players full agency over sort of the framing and narrative control of events, rather than actually playing these actions themselves. So what that means is that the insurgency, the sort of white supremacist insurgency in the South is automated, sort of using this contagion mechanic that we've implemented, that then players can either sort of facilitate or fight against, but they're not directly involved in these events themselves. So when particularly significant events will occur in the game, the Vicksburg Massacre occurs in the game, it is then up to the players. The Democratic players might be trying to, spin this in a different way, spinning it as a race riot or something, whereas Republican players are more trying to call it out and actually fight that counterinsurgency campaign. But at no point is the Democratic player actually complicit in, playing the card that says I am killing, 400 people. That was something that we really grappled with a lot throughout our design process, and that we thought was very important to highlight at the beginning of this presentation. So what were our learning objectives? What were our goals in setting out when we started to design this project? They were really three. First and foremost, A Splendid Failure is an educational war game designed for a high school or college level academic context, to both learn more about American history, as well as the dynamics of American politics, and of post-war Reconstruction more writ large. So the first goal was that we wanted to illuminate this hidden history, because the period of Reconstruction is often, is often either obscured or misunderstood over the course of the past 140 years, either initially by sort of Confederate apologists, and narratives of American exceptionalism. And sort of as we've gone on through time, a lot of the sort of details have sort of gotten taken out. It's become a little bit more murky. I'm sure most people that are attending this presentation right now probably remember that your high school history treatment of Reconstruction was something to the tune of, there were some Northern carpetbaggers that came in and were very corrupt, took over the government in the South, and that's the reason that it failed, or something to that effect. And so we wanted to really address that issue. We wanted to return agency, return the focus to, a lot of the major players that were actually involved in these political negotiations, both at the local level, but especially at the national level. And then we wanted to really highlight the political compromises that were made at the federal level that eventually led to the failure of radical Reconstruction. So that brings us into that second major point that we were looking at, which is the trade-offs between democracy, counterinsurgency, and social progress. And this is something that we wanted to highlight when we started working on this project, which is in July or August of 2021. This is something that's very much at the forefront of our minds with the pullout from Afghanistan, and with a lot of other other efforts that the U.S. has made over the course of the past 140 years that have some eerily similar echoes to a lot of these trade-offs that we were seeing in post-Civil War Reconstruction, where political objectives sometimes ran afoul of social progress, or made it difficult to conduct an effective counterinsurgency campaign. So we wanted to really highlight those trade-offs and help people to understand sort of why some of these compromises happened. See how that this was a very intentional thing that occurred, that there were actors at the federal level that were making active decisions to give up social progress in the South, or to give up their counterinsurgency campaign for political expediency in some cases, or for economic development in others. And so this brings us to our third point, which is sort of termed the room where it happens. Giving us, we wanted to give players of the game more insight into sort of the dynamics of the American political system, and the ways in which it really does, if not inhibit, then at least present obstacles to drastic reform or drastic change of any sort. And so it's no surprise that the initial analogy that laws are like sausages, this whole idea of like lawmaking being like sausage making, they cease to inspire respect in proportion to how they are made, and in proportion to how much we know about how they're made. It's no surprise that that quote was actually first came out in 1869 by a Democratic candidate for governor in Vermont. So he was somebody who was very directly involved, actually, in this political process. That, as we will see, through which these sort of incentive structures and bargaining dynamics inherent in sort of American democracy, for better or for worse, often lead the American public to groan about a lack of transparency in government, the dysfunction, quote unquote, in the federal government's ability to enact sweeping change, despite sometimes having popular support. So we wanted to really get into this, the detail, like the nitty gritty of how the sausage making happens at a congressional level, and teaching students to understand a little bit what are some of those bargaining dynamics that lead us to arise at compromises in most of our legislation. And that's something that can be applied as much to legislation today as it can in 1867. So to give us a brief overview of some of the components in a Splendid failure, I wanted to start off sort of talking about the three sort of major, battlefields or areas of conflict. So first you have our map. This sort of centers where all of the players are playing their actions. We have a nice map of the U.S. during this time period. Shows us nice discard piles for all of our cards. Tells us useful keys, election results table, turn tracker, victory points, all sorts of good stuff. This sort of centers the battlefield. We then have the legislative agenda, which shows us the different policies that caucuses are competing to try to pass. And then we have the caucus tableaus, which this is just sort of an overall breakdown. We'll go into them a little bit more later. But this is something that's given to each of our players. They each are assigned a faction. And this sort of gives them a little bit of a historical background, what their objectives are, what sort of resources they have to work with, what their constraints are, who their potential allies and enemies are, helping them to really get into some of those dynamics right off the bat. And so we then go to the card portion. So those first three, that was the caucus tableaus, the legislative agenda, the map. Those are sort of the standalone major pieces of the game. But this overall really is a card-driven game. So we have state cards, that's what you see on the left, and then action cards, which is what we see on the right. So on the left, those state cards, those show us which caucuses from the Republican and Democratic Party compete in that state. Sort of on the bottom left and bottom right, you can see the legislative votes and the tax revenue that are awarded to the caucus that controls that state during any given year, as well as a couple of other details that we'll get into, talking about the sort of the bureaucratic tendency, the underlying support for different parties at the local and state level bureaucracies in that state, as well as room for playing influence. And then on the right, we see the action cards. So action cards are used essentially, you purchase them, you pay an activation cost, and then they have different effects on the states. So those states are sort of where the conflict is occurring. Your players are competing to try to win states, and then from states you derive legislative votes and tax revenue as your resources. And then on states, you play action cards, which give us these things that we see in the bottom. Those on the bottom left, we have economic development counters that increases tax revenue coming out of a state. In the red, we have insurgency counters. We'll get into that in a second, but that has negative economic and political impacts on a state. Then we see those orange and green dice. Those are influence dice for the Republican and Democratic parties that influences how likely a party is to win an election in that state. And then we, of course, have the money. That's the actual tax revenue that's being drawn from a state. And so you essentially play actions onto the state, you creating economic development, insurgency, or influence in the state, and then you draw from the state resources that are legislative votes, which help you pass policies, tax revenue, which allows you to then further power your cards. So just to give a brief overview of some of the player factions, there are 7 different factions or caucuses that we allow players to take up. Now, these caucuses are sort of more ideological sort of streams within each part of the Republican and Democratic parties at the time. They're not necessarily, self-identified, actual caucuses of the time. And so on the Republican Party side, we have 4 caucuses. Those are the 4 on the top. The Freedmen, which are largely the newly free Black Americans in the South, sort of looking for social equality and new civil liberties. The Radicals, which were the prominent abolitionists, and those who are really seeking the immediate, uncompromising eradication of slavery and its sort of derivatives throughout the country. The moderates, who are primarily concerned with sort of economic development, especially in the Northeast. And then the liberal Republicans, which sort of are more of a swing caucus that sometimes ally with the Republicans, sometimes with the Democrats, in order to pass policies. Their victory points, importantly, are sort of straddle both parties. And so they sort of play this sort of kingmaker role between the two parties. Then on the bottom, we have the 3 Democratic caucuses, the Redeemers, the essentially post-Confederates in the South, the Bourbon Democrats, which are more throughout the Midwest, favoring more decentralization, and then the regular Democrats, which represent sort of the political machines of the Northeast, especially in Boston and New York. We don't have to go into all the nitty-gritty of everything, all the text on those tableaus, but just giving you a general idea of who those caucuses are. So how do we play this game? What are we trying to do? As I said, each caucus is going to have, it has 5 particular victory conditions that it's trying to achieve over the course of the game that give it victory points. So these victory points come from both passing policies. Each caucus is going to have 3 particular policies that it's trying to pass, as well as 2 different sort of game state milestones that it's trying to accomplish. So, for example, the moderates are trying to, one of their milestones is that they're trying to really concentrate economic development in Ohio and in New York. They want to hit a certain number of economic development counters there. And from a policy side, they're trying to do things such as pass the national banking, the Department of Justice or the pig iron tariff. The Redeemers, on the other hand, are trying to sort of, they're trying to take political control of the South. So they get victory points from doing things like winning elections throughout the South. They're trying to pass policies that largely pardon former Confederates, that help to re-enfranchise those who have been, who served in the Confederate Army, things like that. And so they get victory points for that. So this is that second condition. That's your individual victory points that each caucus can get. However, in order for these victory points to mean anything, your caucus has to be part of the party that wins the election of 1876. We'll talk about how elections are contested in a second. But this is a very important point, that in order to win, you have to sort of win on this two-tiered process. That in the first place, your party as a whole, Republicans or Democrats, need to win the election of 1876. And then within that party, whichever caucus has the most victory points from achieving these policy and milestone conditions, that caucus is considered the overall winner of the game. So this is meant to sort of go with our overall. It's a cooperative competitive style of play where you are, semi-cooperatively playing with your party against the other party, but you're also trying to pursue your own agendas within your party. And this really speaks to that initial educational goal that we have of talking about sort of the multi-layered facets of American democracy and party politics. So this is just to give us a little sort of visual about what the game sort of looks like. On the left, you can see 1867, the first year of gameplay. That's sort of the initial setup. We've got the map sort of centering it. No counters or anything are present yet. The states are divided across the 7 caucuses according to who won the election of 1866 historically. There's dramatic advantage for the Republicans on turn 1, something to the tune of they control almost 80% of the states. It gives them a huge legislative vote and monetary advantage at the beginning of the game that the Democrats are trying to catch up from. However, through gameplay, as we'll see, through the use of insurgency, through the use of sort of these like cheaper, less costly tactics, the Democrats typically by mid-game, which we can see on the right in 1872, do tend to sort of balance that out. And from about 1871, 1872, which is the midpoint of the game, onward, you tend to see a much more balanced play between the two. So there really are sort of 2 eras of this game. The first, where the Democrats are kind of trying to play catch up and spoil anything the Republicans are doing. And then the second half of the game, which is more of an even sort of contestation of wills back and forth between the parties. So to talk just briefly about the sequence of play, the taxonomy of a round, there are 5 major phases within every round. So you can see on the right, that's the turn tracker. There are 10 years, 10 rounds, 10 years. There's an election every other year. That's those dark years on the bottom. So first off, the first phase is resource collection. So that's when everybody's going to be collecting money based on their tax revenue from all the states they control, plus any economic development in that state. Second, there's an insurgency round, which is in which all players roll a d20 for any states that have significant populations of demobilized Confederate soldiers. And so if they hit a certain number or below, that's going to start a insurgency counter in that state, and then sort of spreads both within the state and into neighboring states through the sort of contagion model. Then we go into player turn phases, which are 3 and 4. So this is once again talking about that sort of semi-cooperative structure of the game. First, we have a phase in which all 3 players that are part of the Democratic Party play simultaneously. So they all declare how many action cards they're buying. They purchase action cards. They play action cards. They can freely trade resources between each other during this time. And then they can try to propose a policy that they want to try to pass. And then that policy goes up for a vote across all 7 caucuses, passes or doesn't pass. And then any effects from those cards are all adjudicated, both from action cards and policies. So the Democratic Party all takes their turn, and then the Republican Party, all 4 caucuses there, all take their turn. Same deal. They buy their action cards. They play their action cards, propose or vote on a policy that then goes up for vote across all 7 caucuses. So we're really digging deep on this idea that you are playing an individual caucus. You have your own objectives, but you are still playing semi-cooperatively with your party as a whole. And then finally, in off years, as mentioned before, we do have elections in each of in even numbered years, we do have elections. So that's in 68, 70, 72, 74, 76. There's elections which sort of reorient which caucuses own which states. And this, of course, reallocates resources according to political influence that's been played in those states. And that's what we're going to get into next, is talking about this core mechanic that really drives the game, which is the elections. So to briefly jump into this, on the top right, you can see we have the state card for Florida. We can see on the left, the Freedmen compete there. They have a base support of 52%. On the right, the Redeemers compete there for the Democrats. They have a base support of 48%. And so what we're looking at here is a situation in which if no influence is played, if no action cards are played in Florida whatsoever by the time of an election, then the sort of default election result is going to be 52 to 48 Republican win at this point. However, there are things that the Democrats can do to try to contest this election. So as they play action cards that, as we said before, increase the political influence, Democratic influence in the state. So you can see on the bottom left-hand corner, there's an orange Democratic influence die set to 1. That means that there's now a +1 Democratic influence in Florida. This means that we now will have to actually contest this election. So we look at the net influence, which is sort of the columns on that table in the top left. That's our election table. So we see that 4th column from the left, 1D, 1 Democratic influence. And then we go down to the bureaucratic tendencies of the state. which, as we can see on that card, it said BT is lean Republican, LR. So second to the bottom row on bureaucratic tendency is lean Republican. Fourth to the left, influence is one Democrat. And so we see that we're essentially going to be flipping a coin. We're going to be rolling 1d2 in order to determine what the results of this election are. So we say that we flip that coin, or we roll a d4, 1, 2 counts as a 1, 3, 4 counts as a 2. And say that we get a 1 on this die. So if we get a 1 on this die, we add that to the Democrats' base support, and now the overall outcome of this election is now still a Republican victory, but it is now 51-49. And so the Republicans still held this state. So how can Democrats win this state? Well, they would need to either be playing more influence than just that 1, or they can work through the second mechanic we're going to talk about, which is insurgency. And so the insurgency, which are these red counters again, as you can sort of see in the South in that picture on the bottom left. Insurgency has 3 effects on the game. First, it reduces the amount of tax revenue that Republicans can collect from southern states. 2, it increases or enables a bunch of additional democratic actions. And then 3, it influences election odds, as we said. So if you go to that bottom right, that election table again, it's playing that same net influence of 1 Democrat, so still that same column. But now we're going to change the bureaucratic tendency of the state, because the insurgency, basically, insurgents through intimidation and fear tactics are essentially changing how effectively Republicans are able to assert their influence in the state. The insurgents are essentially making it more difficult for Republican initiatives to be executed, and they're making it easier for Democratic initiatives to get executed, therefore amplifying Democratic influence. So we're going to change that bureaucratic tendency with 1 insurgency counter, moves up from lean Republican to now divided government. So now we're in that third row, which now means that we're rolling a 1d4. So rather than that coin flip from before, which was 1d2, which gave us a 50-50 chance of the Democrats winning because they win ties, now suddenly the Democrats went from 50% chance of winning this election to a 75% chance of winning this election. So if you roll a 2, a 3, or a 4 on that die, the Democrats are going to end up winning that election because the base support was 48-52. So if they get a 50, 51, 52, they're going to win. So the insurgency really amplifies that influence that the Democrats are then playing there in that state. And that's a major mechanic through which Democrats are able to sort of overcome their early game deficit in terms of resources. Now, the third core mechanic of our game is negotiation and policy. So I should have made this a little bit bigger, but on the left, you can sort of see some of the policies that were on our agenda. And you can see that each policy has multiple, or most of the policies have multiple caucuses that would score a victory point from them. And many of them are within the same party, but a few of them are actually cross-party. And this introduces some interesting negotiation dynamics, where you can see, especially with the liberal Republicans, who are that swing vote, as we talked about before, often actually working with Democratic caucuses in order to pass policy that's detrimental to the rest of the Republicans, but is simultaneously giving the liberal Republicans victory points. The same thing actually happens. The moderates have a few victory conditions that are shared with the Democrats as well. So you can see you start to see some interesting negotiation dynamics start to play out, where the Democrats, even though they start at this severe deficit in terms of resources, we've seen actually games where as early as round 2, the Democrats start passing their own policies and start pulling ahead, simply because you have the moderates and the liberal Republicans saying, okay, well, we're confident that we're going to win the elections, and therefore we're okay with trying to work with the Democrats to try to pass some of these policies, over the objections of our radical and freedmen counterparts in our own party. So this adds some really interesting dynamics, lots of cross-table talk that happens, and something that we really have enjoyed being able to see the sort of fiery debates and frankly filibustering that we start to see, that really is kind of emblematic of the way that American politics sometimes functions in real sort of compromises over legislative debates. So that's been something that's very interesting to see. It's something that we constantly try to work on and try to work into our rules. So for a negotiation, we say that you can share resources freely within your party on your turn, and then you can, of course, share your legislative votes towards policies across party, but you can't really share resources across party. So that's once again talking about that sort of like semi-cooperative structure of the game. We do, because there is a lot in this game, we do have a couple of different ways that we try to make the game a little bit more accessible to first-time players, especially, as we said, our audience is really students. We're not necessarily expecting everyone to be a professional wargamer and be able to understand what a combat results table is, or election results table in this case, or be able to initially process what all of these odds are, be able to make these snap judgments about where they should be competing, what their strategy should be. So we try to give a couple of different hints that try to make the game a little bit more accessible. So the first, and I think most aesthetically pleasing of these hints, is our use of color coding. So everything throughout the game that is green, so it means that it's going to be something that is Republican in some way. Everything that's that sort of rust color, that brown rust color, means it's something sort of Democrat, and anything that's sort of beige in the center means it's contested or a swing. So, for example, the state of Rhode Island is dark green. That indicates sort of Republican and Democratic players alike that's probably that's a pretty safely Republican state. We probably don't need to worry too much about competing there, because the Democrats aren't going to take Rhode Island unless they devote considerable resources there. It is possible. But they would have to devote an incredible amount of resources there that wouldn't make a whole lot of strategic sense to a new player. So we say, yes, you could figure that out by saying, okay, well, there's a 66 to 34 Republican advantage at base, plus it's a strong Republican bureaucratic tendency. To someone who's familiar with the game, you would look at those numbers and say, okay, obviously that's not worth Democrats competing in. However, to a new player, that might not be so obvious. So we say, okay, we color code it, we make it green, and we try to use that as a way of just kind of signaling to people that that's going to be a strongly Republican state. Same thing with Georgia on the right. You can see same thing, 34-66, except now to the Democrats' advantage. Same thing's going on there, where it's going to be very unlikely the Republicans are going to take Georgia. Historically, they only did in 1 year over the course of really over 100. And so that's something that we that we really instrumentalized in there as well, as saying like, okay, Georgia's not going to go Republican, most likely, unless you devote way too many resources there. So don't worry about it. Make it rust colored. Unless you're a experienced player who has some crazy new strategy, that you want to test out. If you're a new player, there's no reason to worry about that state. Instead, we say to a new player, okay, focus on those beige states, focus on Ohio, right in the center, where you can see that it's 51 to 49. Slight Republican advantage there, but honestly, it's divided government. It could really swing either way depending on the influence that's being played there. The second thing that we talk about is player aids that we use. So sort of on the right, we can see on the back of every caucus tableau, every caucus is going to have a special ability, as well as some strategy tips, and also a reminder of what the sequence of play is. So that special ability is, in a large part, is sort of like flavor to help immerse the player more in their particular caucus. In this case, kind of doubling down on the moderate Republicans' role as a party unifier, and also as a really focus on economic development. We say that the moderate caucus is able to have this party donors ability where once per game they collect extra tax revenue based on how well their other Republicans are doing. So that really kind of nudges the player again that, hey, as a moderate, you're supposed to be focusing on money, and then also on trying to help out your other help out the rest of your party, helping make sure that they're all doing well. Because that's your role sort of as like the party, de facto party leader. We also have strategy tips that sort of hammer home that point even more. So we say here for the moderates, essentially, your role essentially in this party is to try to bankroll your party. And now you don't have to do that. You, of course, can do other things. You can just, go off and do your own thing. Don't worry about anybody else. Just as moderate, just, focus in West Virginia and just like overly economic development West Virginia to the total, rejection of everything else. However, through our play tests and through the incentive structures that we've built in here based on history and based on kind of the dynamics of this time, we're suggesting that like, hey, your best chance of success as a moderate is to be really focusing on economic development in New York and Ohio, really holding on to those states, playing a lot of influence there, making sure that those are bastions of your strength. and then using that, all of the money and votes that you get from those two states to really aid a lot of your other Republican compatriots in competing in areas that they might be struggling against, in less favorable races. So we're really like driving home that point of like, what is the flavor of that caucus, of that faction? What are your suggested strategies? Not mandatory by any means. There are multiple paths to victory. But like, this is historically kind of what role your faction played. And so you're probably going to be rewarded by trying to act in a similar fashion. And then finally, we have throughout the entire game on the caucus tableaus, on the map, on some of the cards, this little political spectrum, which is just, once again, a little nudge, a little reminder of for each player of kind of, who your allies might be, who your competitors might be. And so this spectrum sort of ranges from on the left, sort of the most progressive, to on the right, sort of the most conservative. Of course, during this time, Republicans are much more progressive than the Democrats are much more conservative. And so we sort of start off on the far left with the freedmen, who are advocating this really revolutionary ideas of social and communal change throughout the South, also in the North in some cases. And so they have some really pretty radical policies that probably aren't going to get much support on that right hand, on that conservative side of the spectrum. But as we move more towards the right, we can see, okay, we've got the moderate Republicans and the liberal Republicans. They play this role sort of more in the center. They might be more amenable to making a deal with the Bourbons or the regular Democrats, especially when it comes to economic issues. And that's something that we try to emphasize is, we've got social issues, we've got economic issues, there are military issues that are going on, all these different types of policies you can coordinate on. So through the combination of overlapping victory conditions on the policies, as well as the constant reminder of this political spectrum, trying to remind players like, hey, these are some of your enemies and allies, both within and outside of your party. Once again, just trying to really hone that negotiation dynamic and get a lot of that crosstalk and a lot of intra and inter-party competition that we want to see. So that's sort of the overall gist of our game, kind of talking you guys through the where it came from, what the objectives are, what the gameplay looks like. I did want to take a second just to sort of show that, as you all know, wargaming is a very iterative process. And so I just came across some pictures that we've taken throughout the 6 months of our project. And it's, or 4 months of our, wow, this happened really quickly. 4 months of our project. And you can sort of see, starting in that top left-hand corner, the first iteration of this game was a really kind of silly game that we played with index cards and Post-it notes. And, I think we had a couple of dice, and that was it. It was difficult reading each other's handwriting. It was, lots of silliness going on. But really that's where we really honed those core mechanics. And from those core mechanics is where you're able to, build up and build out from. So starting from there, you can see that sort of over time we progressed. We started, creating real cards. We started color coding the cards about midway through, when we realized how difficult it was for people to understand who were new to the game. About 2/3 of the way through, based on a lot of playtester feedback, I think we did 4 or 5 playtests in which in a row, where every person's biggest takeaway or biggest complaint to us was really like the game, really like the mechanics. Why don't we have a map? And we tried to say, well, it's a card-driven game. We don't, the map is not really necessary. You have all these state cards that you're competing over. They said, no, we want a map. We want to be able to see what's in the center. I want to be able to point at it and say, that's what I want. And so about 2/3 of the way through, we implemented the map. Of course, now with the map implemented, it's not that too much really occurs on the map. It is really primarily just a centerpiece of the game. But it's one of those things that if you take it away, everybody complains. And it's there to sort of just like center, provide information, provide some common ground for everyone to be sort of talking about, debating over. But it really, in terms of substantive role, it's really just sort of an informational piece. It gives us our victory point tracker, our timeline tracker, insurgency, economic development counters, victory points, everything like that. But it's largely an aesthetic sort of centering preference based on feedback. And then sort of on the far right, we can see sort of the current state of the game, which is as we presented at our final exam for the Basics of Wargaming class back in December. We are continuing to sort of work on and refine it, though, based on all of our feedback, based on some challenges that we've come across. And that's sort of what I'm going to end on today, is talking about some of those challenges and some of those future plans. So, of course, there's lots of feedback that we've gotten across all of our playtests. If any of you are interested in a playtest, absolutely reach out to me over Discord afterward. We'd love to have you. But some of the major takeaways that we've gotten is, first, in terms of this sort of mismatch in action card selection. We've seen that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, a player will be, really starved for political influence cards. They need to win this election, very important to them. But they draw the first 5 cards that they draw out of the deck this turn are all economic development cards. And you say, well, shoot, what am I going to do with the economic development cards? Of course, we say currently, okay, well, you should be negotiating and trading with action cards from other people in your party. But we really realize that there's not, we're not, what are we operationalizing historically there? What's the real benefit of adding that sort of randomness of what card you're drawing? So we don't really like that. So something that we do want to work toward in the future is adding in some sort of more like a tableau mechanic, where you're able to add in where you're able to actually kind of see what the next few action cards might be, choose from among them. Another thing that we wanted to talk about and work on is the insurgency round. It's become a little bit cumbersome, kind of rolling for insurgency every round, and so instead we want to sort of eliminate the round and incorporate the spread of insurgency still through that contagion mechanic, but actually as sort of a backlash to actions and policies that are being played, rather than being its own designated round, which is just sort of taking up time, bogging down the time. We also wanted to, of course, increase intra-party competition. One of I think probably the biggest sticking point that we've had is saying, why can't the moderate, the freedmen, the liberal Republicans all compete against each other in the same state? Historically, the liberal Republicans ran as the third-party candidate to try to spoil Republican efforts in that state. And there's no reason that we can't, other than it was very hard to implement in the timeline that we had to develop this game. So that's something that we're constantly working on. It does take currently a lot of sort of statistical evaluation, a lot of math sort of on the back end, trying to retain the balancing of the election mechanic currently, because it is dyadic. So we want to turn it from that sort of, only from this only bipolar struggle over states into something that's more multipolar, that allows different caucuses to compete. And we're always looking, of course, to decrease the barrier, to lower these barriers to entry for new players. Especially the election tables, to somebody who hasn't ever seen a combat results table before, seeing, 2 dimensions with all these numbers and different types of dice on it can be kind of intimidating, we found. And so we do want to try to incorporate that more into, a number that actually goes into the states, that says like, okay, this is what this state is a D6 state. And then just however many influence you play on that state, that's how many D6 you're going to roll or whatnot. But that's once again something that's just taking a lot of sort of calculation on the back end to retain the balance that we've achieved through this table in a more simplified structure. And then finally, something that's always a challenge, and something that is true across any war game, is that we want to create ultimately a fun, playable game, but we also want to maintain historical accuracy. So there are some dynamics throughout this time period, especially the Panic of 1873, this massive economic depression that occur, that we say, okay, we want to really drive home how important, how devastating this was to the Republican cause at the time. However, it turns out that when you have a random event that pops up and then utterly destroys a faction's ability to do anything for 2 turns, that's not very fun for players. And that's unsurprising to anybody who's ever played a game. So things like that, that's sort of the most poignant example. But sort of things like that we really want to be working on continuing to balance, trying to bring, trying to maintain that historical accuracy, maintain that educational value, but also, restore some of the playability, restore some elements of fun to the game, and, not scare people away, not make people rage quit because they got, killed by a stock market crash. So those are some of our challenges, some of our future plans. I'm going to open it up now to feedback. I know there are a couple of questions there. Would love to talk to you guys. And, if we continue to, I think we've got about, 5-10 minutes here. But if we sort of continue on beyond this, then we will be moving over to the Discord server. So let me go ahead and look over in the comments here. All right. No problem. So the first the call trip. Yep, we love our D4s, our call trips. What are some changes that we're considering for any follow-on design work on our game? Sebastian, thank you. Hopefully we spoke to that a little bit. As I said, the first thing that we're really looking at doing is evaluating the way that action cards are drawn. So through those tableaus, through possibly implementing some sort of like a party leader or a whip mechanic, where we say, okay, here you can see what the next 10 cards that could be drawn are going to be, and say, okay, the party leader gets to choose what order people within their party get to draw cards or something like that. Incentivizing maybe the moderates or whoever has the most votes or the most money to really be able to exert a little bit more control over their party, while also affording greater player agency in terms of what action cards they're using. So that's one bigger project we want to work on. As I said, we want to try to simplify the insurgency around the election mechanics, make those both into just like very simple numbers that go onto the state cards themselves rather than entire rounds all on their own or tables, whatnot. Try to lower those barriers to entry and reduce the number of components that we have. And then the third, like the really my pet project right now is really trying to figure out how to operationalize a multipolar election system in these states. To be able to say, okay, there's not just one caucus from each party that competes, but you can have spoilers, you can have third-party runs, you can have 5 different caucuses that are all trying to compete over New York. Maybe is it wise? Probably not, but there's no reason that it can't happen. Logically, historically, and so that's something that we do kind of want to implement. It's also been something that we got from player feedback was wanting to be able to say. I want to run in any state. So that's something that we've been looking at. So Fred, have we considered any other errors for the system? Yeah, so that's something that's really interesting. Feedback that I've gotten from, and really from our playtest ourselves, is saying, the dynamics, especially the way the negotiation and election dynamics, they apply to a lot of eras of American history. I mean, even something as one feedback I got from a playtest, which I think was spot on, was someone saying, over debate over legislation that's currently in Congress, all of whatever the Democrats are trying to pass through the Senate and the House of Representatives, and everybody complains that Joe Manchin is holding up this blah 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 blah. Regardless of your view on that issue, on the policy itself. I mean, the fact is that essentially, this is our system at work. This is, Joe Manchin is playing this sort of, a moderate Democrat faction that's not entirely on board with this, much more, this more radical and more progressive, changes that are being trying to be passed by or proposed by more left-wing elements of his party. And so, when people say, oh, it's Joe Manchin as a person, or it's this, that, there are very specific political and electoral incentives that influence his calculus, that influence him as a player in this game to vote certain ways. And that's something that, I think that our system does very well. And I think that there's no reason that couldn't be applied to really any other type of debate, political debate. So that's a great question. And yeah, something I like you're talking about, labor issue within a single plant to take it to a micro level. Yeah, there's no reason that can't work. This is ultimately, it's a political game, it's a negotiation game, and negotiation and political conflicts happen at all levels, all scales. There's no reason that this has to be limited to federal or national legislature either. Moving on. Okay, so. Sebastian, what advice would we give ourselves back when we started this design? That's a good question, of course, always is. I mean, the biggest question I would give back to myself or to other students in the class is just to be aware of how short our timeline was. I know this is something that is, an external constraint imposed on us by the fact that we were taking this through a course. But knowing, you have to be able to hurry up and move through very quickly. And especially having a team of, we had 3 people working on this. We're 3 different grad students with all 3 of us, very busy schedules. Some of us have kids, have all sorts of different things, and like, trying to convince 3 grad students that they all need to, devote 30 hours a week right now, this week or next week or whatever it is, and say, hey, you need to drop everything else and like, do this push on this game that we're creating. That was difficult, just kind of organizing to make sure that 3 people with very busy schedules and classes and everything, that we were all on the same page, working consistently at the same time towards the same goals. It's that communication and that time pressure that was definitely the biggest challenge. So I guess Sebastian, I'm guessing you're going to bring this advice back to your future classes. I would say just to make sure that there's consistent communication, constant communication, an abundance of communication about expectations and timelines. Just really, driving that home from day one. What does the insurgency mechanic represent? To just quickly say that, I think we're almost out of time. Insurgency mechanic represents, yes, generally it's going to be the levels of communal violence that are being affected within that area, within that state. So this can range anything from militias patrolling polling places to actual massacres that are occurring, all sorts of different events, armed political rallies, things like that. These are actually all occurring in the game as events, and the more insurgency counters that you have in a state sort of amplifies how severe these events are. So if you have 3 insurgency counters in a state, somebody who's playing, if the Democrats play, a card, they have different cards that might be able to convert insurgency tokens into influence or something to that effect. And that's essentially saying, with this high level of communal violence, discontent, they're able to actually take that, leverage it into playing a armed rally card, or playing an armed march card, or saying that there's going to be there's some like assassination cards, things like that. And so they're able to actually turn those into political influence in that way. So thank you guys very much all for coming. I know there's some questions about sourcing and mechanics on the back end. Be happy to talk about that in the Discord server. So I'm going to hop over to that now. Thank you guys very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.